There are many systems you can find yourself frustrated over in Victoria 3 when you don't know how they work. Warfare is certainly one of them, and in this video I'll go over the basic mechanics around military units and warfare. Hopefully it is helpful to some people either frustrated with the system or who don't know where to start with it. If you find the video useful, subscribing would of course be appreciated. My name is Dustin and let's get into it. So why do you need a military? What do you get out of it and what can you do with it? Well, the obvious answer is conquering land to acquire more resources and more pops. But there are a few other important reasons to build up your military as well. Military is an extension of diplomacy. The size of your army in relation to who you are interacting with affects how likely they are to make deals with you and how likely they are to view you as a potential target. For example, if we are playing Spain and we want to form an alliance or a defensive pact with a great power such as Austria, the treaty will require we make significant concessions to them due to the difference in our military strength. Each unit in your military generates power projection based on its average offense and defense, with naval units counting for about 3 times as much as army units. Military strength is also a big contributor to your prestige, especially early on in the game. Building a small navy can easily boost a minor power into the major power ranking or a major into being a great power. Your ranking is most important for the interest rate reduction that major and especially great powers receive. This reduction allows you to run a budget deficit and accrue debt with a much smaller chance of entering a debt spiral. With the normal level of interest, which is around 20%, your interest payments will grow to the point that pausing construction is unable to fix your deficit, forcing you to declare a harsh bankruptcy. For unrecognized countries, the interest rate is even worse, and I recommend not spending into your credit at all. Back to military, sizable armies and navies also enable you to build up domestic warfare industries such as arms factories that both stimulate your economy and lower your goods costs per battalion or ship. This lessens the initial costly appearance that may turn you off of wanting to expand your military to an appropriate size. Your soldiers and officers also predominantly join the armed forces interest group. They may support some laws that you want to pass and are generally a decent one to have influential. What is an appropriate size then? It's going to depend on who you view as a target and who is likely to invade you. Be sure to check the attitudes of any countries that have an interest set in regions you want to operate in, or that have land borders with you. If your aim is purely defensive, you don't necessarily need a military quite as large as theirs, and if you can secure a good defensive pact or two, you can also get away with a smaller army. It is a budget trade-off and a decision you have to make yourself on how big of an army to maintain. This is normally a choice between paying for a larger military or more construction sectors. It's highly dependent on your country's situation and the goals of your campaign. If you want a general goal to aim for, the AI great powers spend between 1/5 and 1/4 of their budget on military when at peace, depending on whether their army is half conscripts or mostly professional soldiers. Conscripts, of course, being more destructive to your economy once you actually enter a war, but much cheaper during peace. Exactly how much you want to spend is really only something you can learn by playing though. I want to briefly mention diplomatic plays before we get into the military mechanics themselves. Wars are started through diplomatic plays that normally occur when you demand something from someone. You can see who is eligible to join a play you are going to create by opening the Strategic Regions map mode and looking at the flags in the region you are starting the play in. When you go to demand something, it will show a prediction, but you cannot trust the prediction screen, as it doesn't account for either side offering a favor to join. If I wanted to conquer Paraguay as Brazil, for example, Paraguay could offer Argentina one of my states to get them to join against me. My advice would be treating any country with a -30 preference or closer to 0 as if it's a possibility they will join. This is especially true if the country happens to have a protective attitude over your opponent. It isn't guaranteed that someone will join if they are within -30 though. You'll have to decide if it's a risk you can take. Also be aware that adding war goals after the play begins will move other countries' preferences towards your opponent as it raises your infamy. This is especially true at 25 infamy and 50 infamy. Going over each of these gives a sizable relation penalty. Now let's get into the basics of armies in Victoria 3. The army system is directly tied to the population and building mechanics in the game. Each battalion you recruit is tied to a barracks building in one of your states, and this building needs to hire pops to work in the battalion. It is important to understand that casualties in warfare directly affect your population and by extension your economy. Deaths in a battalion kill the pops working in the associated building. A decent number of wounded soldiers in a battle will become dependents as well. Only 25% of your population works jobs by default in Victoria. The other 75% are dependents that represent children, most women, the elderly, and disabled veterans. A decent amount of wounded soldiers return as dependents that can no longer work jobs and contribute to your economy. When you create a new battalion, the building needs to be built by your construction sectors before it can start hiring someone. When you create conscripts, the building does not need to be built. It just spawns in the state as an inactive building at first. When the conscripts are mobilized, the conscription center activates and starts hiring local job seekers. When your army is demobilized after a war ends, the conscripts will become unemployed and need to find a new job. The amount of conscripts that you can add to armies is limited by your conscription rate, which is primarily dictated by your army model law and boosted by some military techs. Something to note about the military unit buildings is that they have training rate production methods. This training rate limits the amount of manpower added to the associated battalion per week. So even if your conscription center hires 500 workers in 1 week, they will trickle into the battalion based on the training rate. This is what primarily limits how quickly conscripts can be fully raised. On the army screen, take note of the small buttons at the top. Particularly, this Set HQ button is important if you want an army to return somewhere specific when a war is over. The Move HQ button is down here with the other main actions, but you actually have to set it with the small button at the top once the army has arrived. This can be important for ensuring you always have an army ready in an overseas location, for example. The rest of the army actions are down here next to the Mobilize button. You have to send an army to a front for it to participate in battle. Naval invasions can be launched here, and it will prompt you to select a navy to transport the army. We'll look at naval invasions later. A recent addition to Victoria 3, you can set one strategic objective per army in the current version of the game, and your generals in this army will attempt to attack or defend that state over the other options on the front they are assigned to. This is also where you can initiate transferring units and commanders between armies. There are two main stats that each military unit has in Victoria: offense and defense. This is what primarily decides whether a battle is won or lost, assuming both sides have near equal troop numbers. If your army has a lower offense stat than the enemy's defense stat, generally you should not be advancing unless you have overwhelming troop numbers. Organization directly affects both of these stats. Organization is typically at 100% unless there is a supply shortage. When organization falls below 100%, you get increasingly harsh penalties to both offense and defense. Low organization will cause your armies to crumble, so pay attention to your military supply. Supply shortages typically come from a military goods shortage on your market. For example, if your market does not have enough supply of ammunition. You have to be careful when raising conscripts, as this will add a lot more demand to your military goods that needs to be accounted for to avoid supply penalties. Supply can also be impacted by convoy shortages if your army is fighting overseas. This is where convoy raiding and naval battles become important, which we will discuss later on. Morale is important for ensuring all of your present soldiers can actually engage in battles. In combat, a battalion takes morale damage that results in soldiers disengaging from combat. This is represented by the demoralized category in the battle screen. These soldiers are essentially on cooldown until their morale recovers. Let's say you've just lost a battle and all of your battalions are now at 500 soldiers remaining. If your morale recovery is low, each battalion might only have recovered half of their morale by the time another battle starts. Only half of those 500 will engage in the new battle. On a large front with several simultaneous battles, it is especially important to have morale recovery. Morale loss reduction, on the other hand, reduces how quickly your soldiers become demoralized in battle, allowing your units to fight for longer. Another stat that affects offense and defense is unit experience. Units gain a small amount of experience over time, 1 per week by default, and a larger amount while participating in battles. Taking casualties lowers the experience of units as new recruits are trained to fill the gaps. There are 5 experience levels, and each level gives 5% offense, defense, and morale damage. This is another advantage to having a substantial professional military over relying on conscripts. There are 3 unit types that will make up your armies: infantry, artillery, and cavalry. At least half of each army you have needs to be made up of infantry, or you get large penalties to organization. Infantry normally has the highest defense and cheapest goods upkeep. Artillery typically has the highest offense, and also importantly has kill rate. The more artillery in your army, the more enemy soldiers you will take out of combat during each battle. Kill rate makes artillery useful in purely defensive armies, as well as the obvious choice to pack it into your offensive armies. Artillery also gives a small increase to the devastation a state receives while battles are ongoing there. Cavalry are a more situational unit type. They can be used as the primary offense unit for less technologically advanced countries, albeit without the kill rate bonus, or in some situations when the artillery good is too expensive to produce in the early game. The most important stat that they have, however, is battle occupation. With the exception of hussars, cavalry increase the amount of territory you gain in each battle you win. This can make them vital to quickly occupying a war goal in some circumstances. Generally, the later in the game you get, the more artillery you want in your armies instead of cavalry. Pretty much by the time you are upgrading to shrapnel artillery, it is worth phasing out cavalry in your armies that participate in big and important front lines. In some situations, it may be effective to have a reserve army with a lot of cavalry to sweep through and occupy land once most of the enemy soldiers have been killed on a front line, but I rarely find this is necessary. To upgrade units to new unit types you have researched, you can do it per army here, per unit type if you scroll down, or for your entire military at once on the military tab. Now let's talk about generals. To have your armies defend or advance on a front line, you need to give orders to the generals in each army. If any one of the generals is set to advance, this army will start battles on the front line with one of the generals set to advance leading the battle. Be aware that if any army is advancing on a front line, their battles can borrow troops from your other armies on that front, and allied armies even if their generals are set to only defend. A land battle can borrow more troops than a general has command limit, unlike naval battles where admirals can only borrow up to their command limit. Command limit is fairly self-explanatory. You get a penalty if you have more battalions in an army than command limit. You raise it by hiring more generals or promoting generals. A general can only be set to advance or defend, but there are many variants of these two orders that are unlocked by different traits your general can have. When hiring a general, you want to pay attention to their interest group allegiance and primarily traits that increase offense or defense. The interest group matters because each general boosts their associated interest group's political strength by 2% at the lowest rank, up to 20% if you promote them to a field marshal. Commanders will also rebel with their interest group in the case of a revolution, and they can become the leader of their interest group if they are popular when the current leader dies. A quick note about the traits with morale recovery. In the current version of the game, this appears to only apply to battalions in an active battle under that general, while morale recovery is only supposed to happen when battles are not occurring. This makes the morale recovery given by generals useless in the current patch as far as I can tell. When this is fixed, morale recovery should also be a great trait to look for. You will occasionally notice traits that give bonuses for specific terrain types. There is currently no map mode in the game to display terrain, but every battle takes place in a province with a specific terrain type. Each state in the game is made up of many provinces that can only be seen in the military lens, and they can have terrain ranging from jungle, mountain, plains, to urban, mine, farmland, and more. Because there is no map mode, you just have to guess based on visuals, unfortunately. I wouldn't place too much importance on the terrain traits because you cannot choose where a battle will happen in Victoria, and you cannot choose the general that will lead in the battle either. While a battle is occurring, however, you can see the terrain traits in the top center. The primary offense and defense traits are defensive strategist and offensive planner. These traits can level up to more powerful versions as generals gain experience in combat. I recommend having multiple generals set to defend along a front line, as multiple battles can occur simultaneously. For a big European war, there will probably be around 4 battles occurring along a front line at any given time. Next up is the Army Mobilization tab. This is set per army and also has an overview screen in the military tab showing all of your armies at once. This allows you to boost your army's combat capabilities at the cost of increased goods consumption when you are mobilized for war. These do not increase cost when at peace and demobilized. When you activate one of these, it temporarily reduces that army's organization or morale depending on which one. So I suggest only changing these when at peace or when your army is not on a front line. Prepare for your wars before you declare them. The supplies category gives a bonus to offense and defense for an increase to all goods consumption by your army. The first toggle here is always on and represents the basic increase in cost a military has when mobilized for war. The other two add on top of that and are unlocked by tech. These are normally necessary to match or exceed the offense and defense stats of countries that are technologically on par with you. It gets increasingly expensive to fund modern militaries as the game goes on. Supplements add to morale recovery, which is of course important to ensure all of your soldiers are ready to fight when each new battle starts. You don't want to cause shortages though, so I would recommend only turning these on if your market has a decent amount of the associated good available. A quick note, another source of morale recovery for your armies is military wages. Transportation affects the speed your army can move around and the mobilization speed. In the current version of the game, mobilization speed is so fast that armies are always ready for war regardless, so this stat is kind of irrelevant and you can ignore it. Mobilization speed also does not affect conscript recruitment speed, or it would be more useful. So the only relevant stat in transportation is army speed. If you have multiple fronts you need to move between, or a very large country, it could be advantageous to activate one of these, but generally they are not needed. The morale loss penalty of forced march is also not ideal, and the speed doesn't really make up for it in my opinion. Reconnaissance is unlocked by fairly late game techs, but they are all really good and completely usurp the role of cavalry. They bring massive bonuses to battle occupation, allowing for fewer battles to capture entire states. They also increase the chance of several positive battle conditions occurring for your side during battles. Turn these on as soon as you can get their associated goods. Support equipment also contains fairly late game unlocks, but these are vital to late game wars. They massively improve offense, defense for machine guns, kill rate for chemical warfare, and devastation for flamethrowers. These give a huge advantage to armies with access to them compared to armies without. Finally, we have the medical support category. These two increase the recovery rate of your soldiers. When soldiers become casualties in battle, they either die outright or become wounded. The wounded then either recover over time and rejoin the battalion to continue fighting, or they become dependents and can no longer work. Recovery rate increases the percentage of soldiers that become wounded instead of dying outright. This is quite important for lessening the economic impact the war has on your population and economy. I highly recommend turning on the medical support options once you have researched them. As a caveat, it is of course much more expensive to turn all of these on, so if you have reserve armies or a frontline where you are purely defending against someone, or you are fighting a technologically inferior opponent, you don't need to have everything toggled on for every one of your armies. You can check what unit types your potential opponents are using by clicking on one of their populated states and opening a barracks building. Alternatively, you can go into their battalion's tooltip when you open up that country's information. Before I move on to navies, I want to point out the Enlistment Efforts Decree. For 100 authority, you can place this decree on a state to both raise the percentage of pops that can be conscripted and the training rate of unit buildings in that state. This decree can be very useful to raise more conscripts and raise them faster in states with high population when a war is on the horizon. Naval battles use the same combat attributes as normal battles: offense, defense, organization, and morale. They have one additional stat being blockade strength, which doesn't matter unless you happen to not have enough. I wouldn't worry about it, as calculating how much you will need is not easy until you try blockading. Just know that you likely need many capital ships to properly blockade. The fleet actions are similar to armies, except that fleets are deployed to sea nodes instead of fronts. Similarly to infantry and armies, your fleets need to have at least half of their ships be light ships, or you get a penalty to organization. There is more variance here than there is with army unit types. All of the light ships are direct upgrades of one another except for torpedo boats, which trades some defense for more offense and a bonus to raiding convoys. The other light ships have an escort convoy bonus. Light ships have a much cheaper upkeep compared to capital ships, while still giving a decent chunk of prestige through naval power projection, so they are great for boosting your country rank. Capital ships have much higher combat stats and are good at blockading ports, but they lower the speed of fleets they are in and are much more expensive to upkeep. They also get a massive penalty to convoy rating, so combined with the speed penalty, you want to keep capital ships out of your convoy rating fleets. Capital ships are likely needed if you want to fight other great powers, keep your world trade ports unblockaded, blockade their important ports, and protect any naval landings in wars involving great powers. Each capital ship type is a direct upgrade to the previous. Support vessels are late game units with specific purposes. Submarines you can add to a torpedo boat fleet to massively increase convoy rating efficiency. Carriers are essentially capital ships with a higher offense and lower defense for decisive late game naval battles. Currently, ships act the same as battalions in that battles reduce their manpower by killing pops that work in the associated naval base building. Ship strength then builds back up over time with more recruitment and training rate, just like battalions. The devs have hinted that ships will be actual sinkable entities in a future patch, likely next year. Admirals have an interest-group allegiance and traits just like generals, and they can also borrow each other's ships during naval battles, similarly to generals. Unlike generals, admirals can only borrow ships up to their ship command limit. This means that you can have a maximum of 100 ships on your side in a battle with a fully promoted Grand Admiral. There are 4 types of orders you can give admirals, with a couple of variants of each. These are interception, blockade, raid convoys, and escort convoys. Admirals also have a proportion of ships assigned to them for their order depending on what rank they are. So in a fleet of 100 ships with 2 admirals promoted to rank 5, each admiral will have 50 ships for the purposes of their missions. If one admiral is set to blockade, only half of the ships will add to the blockade strength of the fleet. The 4 admiral orders have distinct effects. On interception, your admiral and their proportion of the fleet will try to start naval battles with other fleets stationed in the same sea node. As mentioned before, when a battle happens, your admiral will borrow ships from other admirals in the sea node up to the command limit of the admiral leading the battle. Blockade attempts to cut off the trade centers and hostile coastal states that are nearest to this sea node from access to the world market. When you have a fleet blockading, you can see the blockade percentage and which coastal trade center is the largest for each market area by opening the market screen. The world market symbol is just a representation of where the most trade happens. Other coastal states of theirs that are not being blockaded will still have market access. You can also click on a state to see its world market access percentage to determine if you are successfully blockading it. The raid convoy order attacks the convoys of hostile nations that have shipping lanes in that sea node. Depending on your ship's attack stat and convoy rating bonus, the convoys are sunk at a quicker rate until there is a 0% supply efficiency. This disrupts the world market trade, treaty goods transfer, and military supply that travels through this node. The escort convoy order counters convoy attack power, and you can see both in the tooltip when hovering over a sea node. To successfully defend against raiding, you need a higher convoy defense in the node than their attack. You can, of course, alternatively just intercept and try to damage their fleet. But since ships cannot actually be sunk, you are essentially just hoping their fleet gets weak enough manpower-wise that they have to leave and recuperate. Finally, let's talk about naval invasions. Naval invasions require you select an army and a navy to participate, and the navy needs to have at least as many ships as the army has battalions, or you get a combat penalty when landing. Naval invading creates a new front where the assigned army will attempt to take control of the state. Until you research landing craft in tier 4 of the tech tree, your army gets a 25% penalty to offense while trying to naval invade as well. If an enemy fleet with at least 25% of the power projection of the fleet you are using to naval invade is present in the node, the naval invasion becomes contested. While contested, your army cannot initiate battles to progress the landing. A more recent addition to the game, you can also conduct a land invasion through countries you have military access with. Military access can be added to a treaty. Mechanically, this works like a naval invasion without the need for ships to be assigned. To conclude the video, I'm going to show an example of what to do during a war. Let's look at Brazil at game start. They start in 2 wars against revolting states. We start with a disadvantage on both fronts. In the north, they have twice the units we have. Our army has a higher average offense and defense though, because we have slightly more line infantry and a cavalry unit, compared to their mostly irregulars. On the front screen, we can also see that their general is set to attack. Because we are so outnumbered, I'm going to set our commander on this front to defend until we have whittled down their manpower and have an advantage. Our commander here also starts with a woodland trait that gives forested defense. Looking at the map here, I'd say there is a high likelihood of a forested tile being chosen for a battle. Now moving over to the southern front, we are outnumbered here as well, but not by as many units. The enemy army has a similar unit composition as ours this time, and their commander is also set to attack. Our commander has decent traits for battle conditions and a morale loss reduction. This front will likely need to be bolstered with additional units. There is little chance of an attack being successful here currently, as we are both outnumbered and don't have an attack advantage over their defense. I'll switch the general here to defend as well. We have a small army in reserve that has not yet been mobilized. Looking at our opponent's nation information, they don't have any ships. This means we don't need to keep this army by our capital to defend from naval invasions. I'm more inclined to bolster the southern front since the enemies on the northern front are primarily irregulars with much lower stats. Checking our market, we have a small buffer of small arms if we want to expand our troop numbers. In the current version of Victoria 3, patch 1.9.6, states lose market access based on occupation percentage, in addition to the devastation mechanic that causes higher mortality and lower throughput in states that are occupied or where battles are being fought. Devastation builds up slowly over time, while the market access penalty is immediate. Essentially, you want to end wars fairly quickly to minimize the damage you do to the battleground states. The low market access kills industry in the state and will massively drop standard of living and raise mortality. This reality, combined with the decent financial situation Brazil starts in and available guns in our market, means that I'm best off raising conscripts to end the war quickly. On my reserve army, I'm going to add conscripts using my states that currently have job seekers, which you can see in the outliner. I'll then mobilize this army, raise the conscripts, and send it to the southern front. It of course needs a general. We don't have anyone with a defense or offense trait in our current available general list, so I'll take the character with home defense from the surveyor trait, and make sure to set him to defend until our conscripts are raised and we have a decent advantage on the front. We start with a surplus of authority, but if we didn't have a surplus, I would consider freeing up authority from elsewhere. This is because we can use the enlistment decree to increase training rate so our conscripts join the army quicker. I'll place the decree on the states we added conscript centers to already. This also raises the conscript rate, so I could add more conscripts to my army if I wanted, but I don't think it will be necessary to win these wars. We could also raise military wages to both encourage more job seekers to switch to soldier jobs and gain a morale recover bonus. It probably isn't necessary for these particular wars, but our wages are currently low enough that I don't mind raising them for a while. You can also keep wages raised during peacetime to gain armed forces approval and additional prestige from army power projection, which can sometimes be nice to have. Now we let time advance until the battles begin happening. In the north, we can see that they outnumber us in the battle, but our defense stat is significantly higher, so we are winning the battle. In the south, they slightly outnumber us in the battle, but our slightly higher defense has us winning this battle as well. As the battles progress, we can see the front advantage estimation moving further in our favor. Our conscript battalions have hired enough soldiers to significantly outnumber the enemy units in manpower, so I'll set my generals on the southern front to advance now. We aren't losing ground in the north currently, so I'll finish my advance in the south and move all armies to the north once the Rio Grandense Republic is occupied. When they collapse, we can then go to our freed up armies and send them to the other front manually. This northern front has more than one state along our front line that our generals could start a battle in. The enemy capital is in the eastern state of Para, so to incentivize our generals to start battles over the Para state, we can go to each of our armies and assign a strategic objective to Para. Now with their capital state occupied, their war support should tick down. Be aware that the more war goals you add to a war, the more things you will have to occupy before the enemy's war support will tick down below 0. When a country's war support hits -100, they will be forced to surrender. So use your strategic objectives to prioritize war goals when you can. You can always hover over war support for a country to see what goals need to be controlled to start the war support reduction below 0. If you or your opponent has allies in the war with no war goals targeted at them, be aware that they will tick below 0 war support and eventually be forced to leave the war once they have sustained enough casualties. There's very little left of our opponent's army now, so I'll finish the advance into their final state to speed up their capitulation. With both wars over, we now have their barracks buildings and will need to reorganize our armies a bit. That's basically everything you need to know about military units and warfare in Victoria 3. I hope that helps some of y'all out with planning and conducting wars. If you found the video helpful, I'd appreciate a subscription or like. The first few videos I created did much better than I expected, and 1,000 subscribers actually looks like an attainable goal now. If you have any suggestions on what I should make a video over next, I'd love to read it in the comments. I play all of the Paradox Grand Strategy games and could make something on a different one as well if anyone is interested. Thanks for watching, see y'all next time.